The shuttle's engines were running their final diagnostic sequence when Commander Elijah Hayes climbed the boarding ramp. His diplomatic credentials verified, his mission classified as successfully completed, and his authorization to depart the planet Kevareth signed by no less than 3 high-ranking officials from the Planetary Council. 18 months. That's how long he'd been stationed on this world, negotiating the most complex treaty arrangement in human diplomatic history. 18 months of careful cultural navigation, endless protocol sessions, and the particular exhaustion that came from being the sole human representative on a planet where every conversation carried species-level implications. He was ready to go home. The shuttle interior was standard Earth diplomatic transport, functional, comfortable, designed for the 3-week journey back to the nearest human station where he'd catch a proper transport to Earth. His personal effects were already secured in the cargo hold. His final reports had been transmitted ahead. Everything was organized, concluded, finished, except Queen Silthara was standing at the base of the boarding ramp. Elijah stopped mid-step, his hand on the railing, his brain attempting to process why the absolute ruler of Kevareth, a being he'd spent 18 months negotiating with, arguing with, and occasionally sharing meals with when diplomatic formality became unbearable for both of them, was standing on his shuttle's landing platform, flanked by 6 members of her royal guard, all of whom looked considerably more armed than typical ceremonial seeing-off required. "Your Majesty," he said, descending the ramp because ignoring a queen blocking your departure seemed diplomatically inadvisable. "I wasn't expecting a personal farewell. The accords are signed. The technology transfers are scheduled. Everything is finalized according to the terms we negotiated." Silthara was tall. Kevareth averaged 7 feet, with builds that suggested their evolutionary history involved considerably more climbing than humanity's, with skin that was deep amber marked with darker patterns that indicated her royal lineage. Her eyes were large and golden, with pupils that could dilate to near full black or contract to pinpoints depending on light and emotion. Right now they were somewhere in between, which Elijah's 18 months of experience suggested meant she was carefully controlling her reactions. Her hair was long and black with silver threads, bound in the complex style that indicated she was here in official capacity rather than personal one. She wore formal robes of deep crimson, the color of the sovereign, off-limits to anyone else under penalty that Elijah had never asked about because some cultural details were best left mysterious. "Commander Hayes," she said, her voice carrying that harmonic quality all Kevareth possessed, like every word was slightly musical. "I cannot allow you to board that shuttle." Elijah felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Your Majesty, if there's an issue with the accords, we can address it through proper channels. But my authorization to depart was granted by officials who do not understand what will happen when you leave." She moved closer, her guards maintaining position but not advancing. This wasn't an arrest, apparently, just a very emphatic blocking of his departure. "You believe your mission is complete. You believe the treaty you negotiated will sustain itself. You are incorrect on both counts. The accords are comprehensive. We spent 18 months ensuring every possible contingency was addressed. The framework for ongoing cooperation is solid. Earth is sending a permanent embassy staff to maintain. The framework will collapse within a month of your departure, possibly faster." She said it with absolute certainty, like she was stating physical law rather than political prediction. "And the consequences will be catastrophic not just for Kevareth-Earth relations, but for my entire world." Elijah looked at his shuttle, still humming with ready-for-departure energy, then at Silthara, whose expression suggested she was completely serious about preventing his departure through physical intervention if necessary. "Can we discuss this somewhere that isn't a landing platform?" he asked. "If you're going to explain why you're essentially holding me hostage, I'd prefer to have that conversation without shuttle engine noise." Something that might have been approval flickered across her face. You understand the situation quickly. This is part of why you cannot leave. She turned and walked toward the palace complex that dominated Kevareth's capital city, a structure that blended organic architecture with impossible engineering, buildings that seemed to grow from the landscape rather than being imposed upon it. Elijah followed, because what else could he do? The guards fell into formation around them, not threatening but definitely present, and he found himself being escorted back toward the very palace he'd spent 18 months trying to leave. His comm device chimed, Captain Williams from the shuttle. Commander, I'm showing a delay in our departure. Is there a problem? Stand by, Captain, Elijah replied. Possible diplomatic complication. I'll update shortly. Understood. We'll maintain ready status. They entered the palace through corridors Elijah knew well by now. He'd walked these paths hundreds of times during his mission. Past the formal reception halls where he'd first presented humanity's proposal. Past the Concord chamber where marathon negotiating sessions had occasionally lasted 30 hours straight. Past the cultivation gardens where he and Silthara had sometimes walked when political deadlock required informal conversation to break through. She led him to her private study, a space he'd been in exactly twice before, both times for conversations that fell outside normal diplomatic frameworks. It was smaller than the formal rooms, more personal, with walls that seemed to be made of living wood carved with historical records and philosophical texts. A large window overlooked the city, showing the sprawl of Kevareth's capital, where millions of beings lived in structures that incorporated their planet's unique flora into architectural design. Sit, Silthara said, gesturing to one of the low platforms that served as Kevareth seating. This explanation will take time. Elijah sat, trying to maintain diplomatic composure despite the growing concern that his carefully planned departure was about to become significantly more complicated. Your Majesty, my authorization to leave was granted by your own planetary council. If there's been a change in circumstances that affects the Accords, I need to know immediately so I can inform Earth. The Accords themselves are sound. The treaty framework is solid. You did exceptional work. She settled onto a platform across from him, her posture less formal than usual. Whatever this conversation was, it had already moved beyond pure diplomatic protocol. The problem is not what you created. The problem is that you will not be here to maintain it. That's what the embassy staff is for. Earth is sending a full diplomatic contingent with specialists in trade, technology transfer, cultural liaison, everything needed to implement the Accords long-term. None of whom are you? She leaned forward, her golden eyes intense. Elijah Hayes, do you understand what you accomplished in 18 months? Not the treaty itself, the actual changes you caused simply by being present. I negotiated a comprehensive agreement that benefits both our species. That was my mission. You did considerably more than that, though you may not have realized it. She stood, moving to the window. When you arrived, Kevareth was technically unified under my rule but practically fractured. 3 major political factions, 2 competing religious philosophies, 7 regional power blocks, all maintaining careful balance that prevented open conflict but also prevented genuine cooperation. You remember the early negotiations, how difficult it was to get unanimous consent on even basic framework. Elijah remembered. The first 6 months had been brutal, every proposal requiring buy-in from so many different groups with competing interests that progress felt impossible. Yes, we spent weeks on issues that should have taken days. And then something changed. Approximately 7 months into negotiations, agreements started coming faster. Groups that had opposed each other for generations suddenly found compromise. Regional blocs that had maintained strict separation began coordinating. Do you recall what changed? We refined our approach, developed better frameworks for addressing competing concerns. No, Silthara turned from the window. You changed what changed. Specifically, the factions started trusting you as an impartial mediator, not Earth, you personally. They believed that you would not favor any particular Kevarith group over another, because you had no historical stake in our internal politics. You became the neutral party that allowed them to negotiate honestly without fear of being disadvantaged. Elijah thought back to those middle months, remembering how meetings had shifted from adversarial to collaborative, how groups that barely spoke to each other had started working together on implementation details. He'd assumed it was natural progression, the treaty framework proving its value. You're saying I accidentally became an internal mediator while negotiating an external treaty. Not accidentally. Your approach, your insistence on understanding every faction's concerns, your refusal to dismiss any cultural consideration as irrelevant, your ability to find frameworks that honored competing values, made you trusted by groups that trusted no one else. You didn't just negotiate the Kevarith Accords. You facilitated the first genuine political cooperation my world has experienced in 3 generations. The weight of what she was saying started settling on Elijah's shoulders. The treaty should survive without me. The frameworks are documented. The agreements are signed by all parties. The frameworks depend on continued mediation by someone all factions trust. The agreements hold only as long as parties believe disputes will be resolved fairly. You establish that trust. You maintain that impartiality. You demonstrated that external perspective could serve internal peace. She moved closer, her expression more vulnerable than he'd ever seen from the absolute ruler of a planet. Without you, the factions will revert to suspicion. Regional blocs will prioritize local advantage. Religious philosophies will clash without neutral ground. Everything you helped build will fragment. Your Majesty, Sulthara, that can't be right. You're their queen, your authority. My authority comes from traditional bloodlines and political power. It commands obedience but not necessarily cooperation. You have something I don't, perceived impartiality. No historical allegiances, no factional interests, just genuine desire to understand our world and help us function better. She sat back down, closer than diplomatic protocol typically suggested. In 18 months, you became what Kevarith hasn't had in living memory, someone trusted by everyone precisely because you belong to no one. Elijah felt his carefully constructed mission completion crumbling around him. You're saying the political stability that allowed the accords to be signed only exists because I'm here maintaining trust across factions. Yes. And if I leave, the structure collapses, not immediately perhaps, but within months. Regional conflicts will resurface. Factional disputes will intensify. The refugee crisis we've been managing will explode as safe territories shrink. Trade networks will fracture. Everything we built together will fail not because the frameworks are flawed, but because no one will trust anyone else to implement them fairly. Elijah stood, moving to the window, looking out at the city where millions of lives apparently depended on his continued presence in ways he hadn't understood. This is not what I signed up for. My mission was to negotiate a treaty. 18 months, clearly defined parameters, specific objectives. I completed that mission. I have a life on Earth, family, career, people waiting for my return. I know your file mentioned family, parents still living. A sister with children you've never met because you've been here. A career you put on hold to serve this mission. She'd stood as well, was beside him now, both of them looking out at her world. I am not asking lightly. I understand what I'm demanding, but I am also showing you the truth. You have become essential to my world in ways that transcend the treaty you negotiated. How long, if I stay, how long until local mediators can be trained? Until trust transfers to Kevarith officials. Years, possibly a decade. This is not a short-term request. Elijah's comm device chimed again. Earth Command, probably wondering about his delayed departure. He ignored it. You're asking me to sacrifice my life on Earth, my family, my career, everything I've worked for. To stay on an alien world indefinitely maintaining political stability that frankly should be your responsibility, not mine. Yes, she said it simply, without apology. I am asking you to sacrifice your planned future because your unplanned present has become crucial to millions of beings who never asked to depend on a human they've never met but who benefit from the trust you've built. It is unfair, it is unjust, it is also necessary. And if I refuse, if I get on that shuttle anyway. Silthara's expression was carefully controlled, but her golden eyes showed genuine pain. I will not force you to stay. You have completed your official mission admirably. You have every right to return home, but I will not lie to you about the consequences. Your departure will destabilize everything we built. The Accords will survive on paper but fail in practice. Kevareth will slide back toward the fractious conflicts that nearly destroyed us before you arrived, and I will have to watch it happen knowing that I failed to convince the one person who could prevent it to stay. Elijah looked at his reflection in the window, a human face among alien architecture, an outsider who'd somehow become essential to a world that wasn't his own. You're asking me to choose between duty to my species and responsibility to yours. I'm asking you to choose between the mission you thought you completed and the reality of what you actually accomplished. She touched his shoulder lightly, a gesture that in Kevareth culture indicated deep respect and personal regard. I understand if you refuse. I understand if you leave. But I needed you to know the truth before you made that choice. Elijah's comm device chimed a third time. Earth Command was definitely getting impatient now. He had authorization to depart. His mission was officially complete. His replacement staff was already en route. By every official metric, he was free to leave, except an entire world apparently depended on him staying. I need time, he said finally, to think, to contact Earth, to understand if what you're saying is actually true or if this is political manipulation to extend human presence beyond what was negotiated. Take whatever time you need. I will show you evidence, faction communications, regional stability reports, mediator assessments of your impact. You can verify everything I've claimed. She stepped back, returning to more formal distance. But while you consider, please remember, I am not asking because it's politically convenient. I am asking because your presence has given my world something we haven't had in living memory, hope for genuine lasting peace. Losing that hope would be devastating in ways that transcend any individual life, including yours. Elijah turned from the window to face her directly. If I stay, and that's a massive if, I would need concessions. Not negotiable terms but actual requirements. Name them. First, I'm not doing this indefinitely with no contact to Earth. If I stay, Earth sends my family here. Not as hostages, as residents with full rights and protections. I'm not sacrificing seeing my nieces grow up. Agreed, we will establish family relocation protocols. Second, this becomes an official embassy posting with full diplomatic staff, not just me operating alone. I'll serve as lead mediator, but I'm training Kevareth officials to eventually take over these functions. I'm building toward my own obsolescence. Also agreed. We want local capability, not permanent dependence. Third, compensation. Whatever Earth is paying me for this mission, triple it. If I'm giving up my career trajectory, I'm not doing it while going broke. I will personally supplement any compensation Earth provides. Money is irrelevant compared to the value of your continued presence. Elijah studied her face, trying to determine if this was genuine crisis or sophisticated manipulation. You really believe the stability will collapse without me? I know it will. I've seen the assessment reports. I've watched faction interactions deteriorate when you're not present to mediate. I've read the communications from regional leaders who specifically cite your judgment as reason to maintain cooperation. Her voice softened. And I've personally experienced the difference between governance with you as trusted advisor versus governance without that external perspective. You've become essential not just politically, but personally to how I approach leadership." That last admission hung in the air between them, something more than political necessity, something that felt personal in ways that complicated the already impossible situation. "I need to contact Earth," Elijah said. "Explain the situation. Get authorization for whatever happens next. This decision affects human diplomatic policy, not just my personal plans. Of course, use whatever facilities you need. Communicate freely. I want your choice to be informed, not coerced." She moved toward the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, Commander Hayes, I hope you stay, not just for political reasons. You've become significant to me in ways that transcend your mediator role. Losing your presence would be personally devastating regardless of the political implications." Then she was gone, leaving Elijah alone in her private study with impossible decisions and the growing awareness that completing his mission might actually mean staying to ensure it didn't fail. His comm device chimed again. This time he answered. "Commander Hayes," Earth Command said, their voice tight with concern. "Your shuttle reports you've been detained. Do we need to initiate extraction protocols?" Elijah looked out at the city, at the world that apparently needed him in ways he'd never intended or anticipated. "Negative on extraction," he said slowly. "But we need to discuss a significant complication in the mission parameters. It appears my return may need to be delayed." "Delayed? Commander, your mission is complete. You were scheduled to depart 40 minutes ago. The mission completion status may have been premature. I'll explain in my full report, but the short version. The political stability required for treaty implementation apparently depends on my continued presence as neutral mediator. Queen Silthara is requesting, not demanding, requesting, that I extend my posting indefinitely." There was long silence from Earth Command. Finally, "Commander, are you being coerced?" "No. I'm being shown the actual consequences of my departure, and asked to make an informed choice about whether completing my mission means leaving or staying. Stand by. This requires consultation at the highest levels." The connection went a hold status, leaving Elijah alone with his thoughts, an empty shuttle, and the most consequential decision of his diplomatic career. His mission was complete, except apparently it had only just begun. The conquered chamber was where Elijah had spent hundreds of hours over 18 months, facilitating negotiations between factions that had barely spoken to each other before his arrival. It was a circular room with seating arranged in concentric rings. No head table, no position of primary authority, just equal access to the central speaking area where proposals were presented and debated. The architecture itself embodied the egalitarian principles that Kevareth aspired to but rarely achieved. Now it was filled with representatives from every major political faction, every regional power bloc, every philosophical movement that had contributed to the Accords. Silthara had called them all together at Elijah's request. If he was going to make an informed decision about staying, he needed to hear directly from these groups about whether her claims were accurate or exaggerated. "You understand why we're here," Silthara said from her position in the first ring, not elevated above anyone, just one voice among many, which was how she'd insisted on participating throughout the negotiations. "Commander Hayes requires clarity about the actual impact of his potential departure. I've made claims about the fragility of our current stability. He deserves to hear from you directly whether those claims reflect reality." Regional leader Kenthvar stood from the second ring, representing the southern territories that had been most skeptical of human involvement initially. "I will speak plainly, as the commander prefers. When these negotiations began, my region refused to coordinate with the northern blocs. Historical grievances, resource competition, cultural differences, all made cooperation impossible. We would have opposed any treaty that advantaged the North. And now," Elijah asked from the center area, standing where he'd stood so many times facilitating these exact conversations. Now we have joint infrastructure projects, shared resource management, coordinated development plans. Not because those historical grievances disappeared, but because you demonstrated that external arbitration could ensure fairness. You understand both our perspectives without favoring either. You found frameworks that honored both sets of concerns. Kentvar's expressed one by one, representatives stood and spoke. The trade consortiums that had negotiated complex resource-sharing agreements they would never have accepted without neutral oversight. The cultural preservation groups that had found ways to maintain traditions while adapting to necessary change, because someone helped them see those weren't contradictory. The refugee advocacy organizations that had finally secured protections, because their concerns were heard by someone with no political reason to dismiss them. Each testimony built on the last, painting a picture of systemic change that Elijah hadn't fully recognized while living through it. He'd been so focused on the specific negotiations, the immediate problems, the daily work of treaty construction that he hadn't stepped back to see the comprehensive transformation his presence had facilitated. "Commander Hayes," said Council Member Yavara from the Fourth Ring, speaking for the first time. She was elder generation, had served in planetary governance for decades, and carried authority that transcended her official position. "I opposed human involvement from the beginning. I believed outsider presence would corrupt our traditions and impose foreign values. I voted against your mission authorization." "I remember," Elijah said carefully. "You made your position very clear during early sessions. I was wrong, not about the risks, those remain real, but about the benefits." She moved to stand in the center area with him, a gesture that in Kevareth political culture indicated speaking with complete honesty. "You didn't impose foreign values. You helped us identify our own values that had been obscured by factional conflict. You didn't corrupt traditions. You helped us distinguish between traditions worth preserving and traditions that served only to maintain power structures. You were the mirror we needed to see ourselves clearly. That's very generous, but it is not generosity. It is accurate assessment. You have spent 18 months believing your role was to negotiate a treaty. Your actual role was to demonstrate that impartial governance is possible, that disputes can be resolved fairly, that cooperation serves everyone better than conflict." She placed her hand on his shoulder, another gesture of deep respect. "If you leave, you take that demonstration with you. We will remember it existed, but we will not be able to maintain it alone. Not yet. Possibly not for years." Elijah looked around the chamber at dozens of faces, different factions, different regions, different philosophies, all unified in their message. His departure would destabilize everything. How is this sustainable long-term? I'm one human. I will eventually leave regardless. I'm not immortal. I can't serve indefinitely. "Which is why we need time," Sulthara said. "Time to train local mediators in your methods. Time to institutionalize the frameworks you demonstrated. Time to build trust structures that don't depend on any single individual." She stood, joining them in the center area. "You gave us 18 months of stability that let us experience cooperation. We need more time to make that cooperation permanent. How much time? We don't know precisely. Years, certainly. But finite time, not endless obligation. And what happens to me during those years? I put my entire Earth life on permanent hold. I become functionally Kevareth with occasional visits home." "You become hybrid," Sulthara said. "Kevareth-based with Earth connections. We establish infrastructure to support your family here, maintain your human cultural identity, ensure you're not completely severed from your species. You don't abandon Earth. You extend your service to include both worlds." Elijah moved to the chamber's periphery, looking at the architectural details he'd memorized over 18 months, the carved histories, the philosophical inscriptions, the symbolic representations of unity that Kevareth aspired to. "I need to see the actual evidence, The stability assessments, the contingency analyses, the projections for what happens if I leave versus if I stay. Of course. Silthara gestured to one of her advisors, who activated holographic displays showing comprehensive data, political stability metrics, conflict probability models, economic cooperation indices, all charted over time with clear inflection points correlating to Elijah's mediation presence or absence. The data was damning. Every time Elijah had been absent from the capital for more than a few days, returning to human quarters, taking brief personal time, conducting outer-region consultations, the stability metrics had declined. Not catastrophically, but measurably. And the projection models showed clear trends. Without his continued presence, the probability of factional conflict returning to pre-treaty levels reached 90% within 2 years. This can't all depend on one person, Elijah said, studying the projections. That's not a stable system, that's a personality cult waiting to collapse. You're correct, which is why your mission becomes different if you stay, Silthara said. Not permanent mediation, but systematic training. You work yourself out of a job by creating local capacity to replace your functions. We estimate 5 to 7 years to fully institutionalize impartial mediation structures. 5 to 7 years. Elijah let that timeframe settle. His nephew would be a teenager. His sister would have possibly had more children he'd never meet as infants. His career in Earth diplomatic service would be effectively over. No one spent a decade on one posting and returned to normal career progression. That's not an extension of my mission. That's a complete life restructuring. Yes. Silthara dismissed the displays, leaving just the two of them in the center area while the chamber's other occupants maintained respectful silence. I will not minimize what I'm asking. It is enormous, unfair, beyond your original mission parameters. But it is also genuinely necessary for reasons you've now seen documented from multiple independent sources. Elijah looked at her, really looked, seeing not just the queen who'd blocked his departure but the leader who'd spent 18 months working beside him, learning his approaches, gradually transforming from diplomatic counterpart to something approaching colleague, possibly friend, maybe more. Why didn't you tell me earlier? Why let me think my mission was complete, let me prepare for departure, then drop this on me at literally the last moment? Because I didn't want to trap you. If I'd raised this issue months ago, you would have felt obligated to address it as part of your mission completion. This way, you've fulfilled your official duties. Everything from this point forward is choice, not obligation. Her voice softened. Also because I hoped I was wrong, that the stability would prove self-sustaining, that local leaders would step into mediation roles naturally, that you would be free to return to your life without this burden. But you weren't wrong. No. The assessments confirm what I feared. We need more time. We need your continued presence. We need, she stopped, seeming to reconsider her next words. I need you to stay. Not just as queen, but as someone who has come to rely on your perspective for more than political stability. That admission carried weight beyond diplomatic necessity. Elijah had felt their relationship shifting over 18 months, from formal diplomatic counterparts to genuine working partnership, to something more personal that neither had explicitly acknowledged, because doing so would complicate already complex dynamics. If I stay, he said carefully, this can't be ambiguous. I need clear parameters, not just political terms but personal ones. What is my role? What are the boundaries? What happens between us? He gestured to encompass both of them specifically. Silthara's golden eyes widened slightly, surprise at the directness, perhaps, or recognition, that he was acknowledging the personal dimension she'd just referenced. I don't have clear answers to those questions. I know what I want politically, your continued mediation presence, your institution-building expertise, your impartial judgment. What I want personally is more complicated. Complicated how? You've become important to me beyond your political utility. I value your perspective on governance. I appreciate your honest feedback even when it challenges my assumptions. I enjoy our conversations that have nothing to do with treaties or factions. She moved closer, lowering her voice so the chamber's other occupants wouldn't hear. And I find myself dreading your departure for reasons that transcend political stability. That complication enough for you? Elijah felt something shift in his understanding of the situation. This wasn't just about preventing political collapse. This was about two leaders who'd worked intensely together for 18 months developing connection that went beyond professional necessity. You're asking me to stay not just as mediator but as, what? Advisor, confidant, something more. I'm asking you to stay and discover what we become over time, with honest acknowledgement that I hope we become something meaningful beyond our official roles. She stepped back, returning to more formal distance. But I will not leverage personal feelings to manipulate your decision. Stay for the political reasons if those are sufficient. Stay for personal reasons if those matter more. Or leave if neither reason outweighs your earth obligations. I will respect any choice. Elijah looked around the chamber again, at representatives who'd spoken honestly about needing his continued presence, at data projections showing real consequences of his departure, at Silthara, whose expression suggested genuine vulnerability beneath royal composure. I need to contact my family. Before I decide anything, they deserve to know what's being asked and have input on decisions that affect them too. Of course, use any communication facilities you need. Silthara addressed the full chamber. Thank you all for your honest testimony. Commander Hayes will make his decision with full information. We will reconvene when he's ready to announce that decision. The chamber emptied gradually, representatives approaching Elijah individually to offer personal appeals, express gratitude for his service, or simply acknowledge the difficulty of what was being asked. When finally alone except for Silthara, Elijah said, "This is the most consequential decision of my life, and it's based on assessments that could be wrong or manipulated. They could be, but they're not. You can verify everything independently. Contact Earth analysts, review source data, interview faction members privately. I'm confident because the truth supports my claim." She moved toward the chamber exit. "Whatever you decide, know that I respect the choice even if I desperately hope you choose to stay." Then he was alone in the conquered chamber where he'd spent so much time facilitating conversations between groups that barely tolerated each other. And he had to decide if his real mission was returning to the life he'd planned or staying to preserve the stability he'd accidentally created. His comm device showed messages from Earth Command requesting immediate clarification, from his sister asking when he'd finally be home, from colleagues wanting confirmation about his return date, and one message from Captain Williams on his shuttle. "Commander, fuel is consumed by maintaining ready status. Need decision soon on whether we're departing or standing down." Elijah looked at that message for a long time before responding. "Stand down from ready status. Departure delayed indefinitely. Will advise when situation clarifies." It wasn't a final decision, but it was an acknowledgement that his mission completion had become significantly more complicated than anyone had anticipated. The family call took 3 hours due to time delays and the necessity of secure communication through Earth diplomatic channels. Elijah sat in his quarters, the same modest suite he'd occupied for 18 months, now feeling simultaneously familiar and temporary, while his sister's face resolved on the holographic display with that particular expression that meant she already knew something complicated was happening. "So," Emily said, her 14-hour time difference meaning it was early morning on Earth while Kevareth approached evening. "You're supposed to be on a shuttle home right now. Instead, I'm getting a secure channel call that required diplomatic clearance. Should I be worried? Possibly, definitely confused, maybe angry depending on how this conversation goes." Elijah tried to organize his thoughts into coherent explanation. "My mission is complete. Treaty signed, framework established, everything I came here to accomplish officially finished. But there's a complication. Of course there is. There's always a complication with you. She sipped coffee, earth coffee, real beans, something Elijah hadn't tasted in 18 months. Explain the complication. So he did. The political fragility he'd accidentally stabilized. The factions that now trusted him as neutral mediator. The projections showing collapse without his continued presence. Silthara appearing on his landing platform, refusing to let him leave. The request, not demand, request, that he extend his mission by 5 to 7 years to institutionalize the frameworks he demonstrated. Emily listened without interrupting, her expression cycling through surprise, concern, calculation. When he finished, she said, "They want you to give up another 5 to 7 years of your life to maintain political stability for an alien civilization that should be capable of managing its own affairs. That's the uncomfortable summary, yes. And you're actually considering it. I'm considering it. The evidence is solid. The need is real. If I leave, the data suggests everything I accomplished collapses within 2 years." Elijah. Emily set down her coffee cup. "You've already given 18 months. You've missed birthdays, holidays, family events. David is 10 now. You left when he was 8. Emma is 6 and barely remembers Uncle Eli, who's doing important work on another planet. Your career is on hold. Your life is on hold. How much more are you supposed to sacrifice?" "I don't know. That's why I'm calling you." Elijah moved to his window, looking out at Kevareth's capital as it transitioned toward evening. The calculus is impossible. Personal happiness versus genuine need. My plans versus others' survival. And there's no objectively correct answer. Is there a personal reason you're considering this, beyond the political justification? The question was direct in that way Emily had, cutting through complications to ask what mattered. Queen Silthara indicated that my presence has become personally significant to her beyond political necessity. And I've spent 18 months working closely with someone who's become more than just a diplomatic counterpart. You have feelings for an alien queen. I have complicated feelings for a colleague who happens to rule a planet and who apparently has complicated feelings back. Elijah turned from the window, which shouldn't be relevant to this decision but obviously is. Emily was quiet for a moment, her face showing the mental processing that meant she was taking this seriously rather than dismissing it as his tendency toward overcomplication. What does Earth Command say? They're consulting at highest levels. This affects diplomatic policy, not just my personal assignment. Having a human mediator essentially embedded in alien governance is unprecedented. Because it's a terrible idea that creates dependency rather than building local capacity. Except the local capacity building is literally part of the proposal. I'd be working myself out of the job over 5 to 7 years. Training Kevareth mediators, institutionalizing impartial frameworks, creating structures that don't depend on me specifically. In theory. In practice, you're one person. If you become essential, what happens when you leave? Or get sick? Or decide 7 years is enough and you're done? The whole structure collapses again, just delayed. That's my concern too. But Silthara argues that 7 years of stability gives them time to develop sustainable institutions. And the alternative, me leaving now, definitely causes collapse. So it's certain immediate failure versus potential future failure after years of capacity building. Emily stood, moving around her apartment, Earth space that looked strange and familiar to Elijah simultaneously. Let me ask you the real question. If this were any other diplomatic posting, any other alien world, any other political situation, would you be considering staying? Or is this specifically about Kevareth and specifically about Silthara? Both. The need is genuine regardless of personal feelings. But yes, the personal dimension makes me more willing to accept the sacrifice than I would be for any random posting. Then you need to be honest with her about that. If you stay, it can't be ambiguous whether you're staying as duty or staying because you want to see what develops between you. That ambiguity will poison everything. I know. She said something similar, that we discover what we become over time, but neither of us has defined parameters for what that means. Because you're both terrified of being explicit and discovering your expectations don't align. Emily smiled slightly. Elijah, you've spent your entire career being diplomatic, finding frameworks that let people avoid direct confrontation. Sometimes you need to just state clearly what you want and see if the other person wants the same thing. That seems risky. Everything about this situation is risky. You're considering restructuring your entire life based on combination of political need and personal interest in someone from a different species who rules a planet. Risk is baseline at this point. She paused. What do you want? Not what you should do or what's politically optimal. What does Elijah Hayes actually want? Elijah sat back down, looking at his sister's face across impossible distance. I want to stay. I want to continue the work I started because it feels meaningful in ways my previous diplomatic postings never did. I want to help institutionalize frameworks that actually prevent conflict rather than just managing it. And yes, I want to explore what might develop with Sulthara because 18 months of working with her has been the most intellectually and emotionally engaging relationship of my life, even though it's complicated by species differences and power dynamics and everything else. Then stay, but negotiate terms that protect you from being exploited. Bring family here if possible. Maintain Earth connections. Set clear boundaries about when the mission ends regardless of local politics. And for God's sake, have an actual conversation with Sulthara about what you both want personally instead of dancing around it with diplomatic language. That's terrifying. Being honest about feelings usually is. But it beats spending 7 years in ambiguous quasi-relationship wondering if you're colleagues or something more. Emily's expression softened. I want you home. I want my kids to know their uncle, but I also want you happy. And you sound more alive talking about this impossible situation than you've sounded in years. So if staying makes you happy, even with all the complications, then stay. You're not going to try to talk me out of it. Would that work? Probably not. Then I'm going to support your choice and demand regular video calls with the kids and insist you negotiate family visitation that doesn't require 18-month gaps. She smiled. Also, I want to meet this alien queen who's captured my brother's interest enough that he's considering giving up 7 more years of his life. Elijah felt something loosen in his chest. Permission, maybe, or just acknowledgement that this impossible decision had support from someone who mattered. I haven't decided definitively, but I'm leaning toward staying. Then stay with eyes open, get everything in writing, protect yourself politically, and Elijah, actually talk to her about personal expectations. I know diplomatic ambiguity is comfortable, but you can't build a meaningful relationship on careful non-statements. I'll try to be more direct. Don't try, actually do it. You're terrible at direct emotional communication, but you can learn. You've learned alien languages and cultural protocols. You can learn to state clearly what you want from someone you care about. They talked for another hour about logistics, about how family visits might work, about what Emma and David should be told about Uncle Eli's extended assignment. When the call finally ended, Elijah sat in the evening quiet of his quarters trying to integrate everything. His calm device chimed, Sulthara, I don't wish to pressure you, but several faction leaders have requested updates on your decision. They're anxious about uncertainty. If you need more time, I'll manage their expectations. If you've reached a conclusion, I should know to coordinate next steps. Elijah looked at that message, then out at the Kevareth city illuminated by evening lights that created patterns different from Earth but somehow familiar after 18 months. He typed, I need to speak with you privately, not in your study or formal chambers, somewhere we can talk honestly without it being official consultation. Her response came quickly, The Cultivation Gardens, Eastern Section. I'll meet you there in 20 minutes. Elijah changed from formal diplomatic attire to more casual clothing, human standard, comfortable, not trying to adapt to Kevarith aesthetics. If he was going to have an honest conversation about personal expectations, he'd do it as himself, rather than as the carefully diplomatic version he performed professionally. The cultivation gardens at evening were beautiful in ways that still surprised him after 18 months. Bioluminescent plants creating natural lighting, water features designed to produce specific sound frequencies, pathways that wound through flora arranged in patterns that reflected Kevarith philosophical principles. He found Silthara in the eastern section, sitting on a stone bench beside a small pond where aquatic plants glowed in deep blues and greens. She'd also changed from formal robes to simpler clothing, still recognizably royal in quality but less performative. When she saw him approaching, she smiled. You wanted honest conversation without official framing. This seemed appropriate setting. It is. Elijah sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, a proximity that felt natural after 18 months of working together but which still carried significance. I talked to my sister. She asked good questions that I need to ask you before I make any final decision. Ask them. If I stay, what am I staying as? Political mediator, definitely. Institution builder, clearly. Personal advisor to you specifically, probably. But beyond those roles, what are we to each other? Because 18 months has created connection that feels like more than professional necessity, but neither of us has named it explicitly. Silthara was quiet for a moment, watching the bioluminescent plants pulse in their slow rhythm. Among my people, we would simply state what we want and negotiate from there. But you are human, and your cultural frameworks require more careful approach. So I will attempt directness. I want you to stay for political reasons that are genuine and documented. But I also want you to stay because I value your presence beyond your political utility. I enjoy our conversations. I trust your perspective on governance in ways I trust very few advisors. And yes, I find you personally compelling in ways that transcend professional admiration. That's more direct than I expected. You asked for honesty. I'm providing it. She turned to face him directly. If you stay, I would like us to explore what we might become beyond our official roles. Not immediately, not without care for the complications, but gradually with honest acknowledgement that there's potential for something meaningful. Does that answer your question? It answers the question about what you want. Now I need to state clearly what I want instead of being diplomatically ambiguous. Elijah took a breath. I want to stay. The political need is real, and I find the work meaningful in ways that matter to me professionally. But I'm also staying because 18 months with you has been intellectually engaging and emotionally significant, and I want to see where that continues. I'm interested in you as person, not just as queen. I want to explore relationship potential with full acknowledgement that species differences and power dynamics make it complicated. Silthara's golden eyes widened slightly, surprise at his directness, perhaps, or satisfaction that he'd finally stated clearly what they'd been dancing around. That is remarkably clear communication for someone who usually prefers diplomatic indirection. My sister said I needed to actually state what I want instead of hoping you'd interpret correctly from careful non-statements. Your sister is wise. Silthara's hand found his, a gesture that felt simultaneously natural and significant. So we have mutual interest explicitly acknowledged. Now we need to discuss parameters and boundaries and realistic expectations. You're suggesting we negotiate our personal relationship like a diplomatic treaty. I'm suggesting we apply the same careful framework development that made the accord successful. Clear terms, honest communication, regular reassessment of whether it's working for both parties. She smiled slightly. Also, yes, I'm suggesting we negotiate our relationship like a diplomatic treaty because we're both more comfortable with that framework. than with purely emotional approaches. That's probably the most pragmatic romantic proposition I've ever received. I am a pragmatic person. You know this after 18 months. Her expression became more serious. But I'm also sincere. I want this, whatever this becomes, to work. For political reasons, yes, but also for personal ones that have nothing to do with factional stability or treaty implementation. Elijah looked at their joined hands, human and Kevareth, different biology but compatible enough to hold each other, and felt the weight of decision settling into certainty. Then I'm staying. 5 to 7 years with clear parameters about institution building, local capacity development, and eventual transition. Family visitation built into the terms, regular communication with Earth, and personal time to explore what we're building beyond the political framework. All agreed. I'll have formal terms drafted within 24 hours. She squeezed his hand. Thank you for staying, for believing the need is genuine, for being willing to sacrifice personal plans for collective benefit. I'm not just staying for collective benefit. I'm staying because I want to be here, with you, doing work that matters while discovering what we become together. That is even more honest communication than I expected. Sulthara leaned her head against his shoulder, a gesture that in Kevareth culture indicated trust and affection. We will be terrible at the personal relationship parts initially. We're both too accustomed to political frameworks and careful negotiation. We'll try to mediate our own feelings rather than just experiencing them. Probably, but we'll learn. We learn to work together politically. We can learn to work together personally. They sat in the cultivation gardens while evening deepened toward night, bioluminescent plants providing natural light. And Elijah felt the strange peace of having made an impossible decision that felt right despite every logical reason it was complicated. His comm device chimed, Earth Command with urgent request for status update. He ignored it temporarily, staying in this moment where he'd chosen to extend his mission indefinitely, and discovered that completing his work might actually mean building a life rather than returning to one. Tomorrow would bring formal negotiations, political complications, logistical challenges. Tonight he sat beside someone who'd become important enough that restructuring his entire life felt like fair trade for continued presence. I should contact my sister, he said eventually. Tell her I'm definitely staying. She'll want to start planning family visits. Invite her to Kevareth. I want to meet the sister who convinced you to communicate directly instead of diplomatically. She'll like you. She appreciates people who are honest about what they want. Then we'll get along well. Sulthara stood, pulling him to his feet. Come, we should return to the palace and start making official arrangements. Your shuttle needs to be stood down permanently. Earth Command requires formal notification. Faction leaders need reassurance. And I need to announce that the mediator they depend on has agreed to extend his mission. This is going to generate significant political response. Undoubtedly, some will celebrate, some will object, some will question the wisdom of depending on a human for institutional stability. We'll manage all of it because we're both skilled at political navigation. She paused at the garden entrance. And eventually, when the political complications settle, we'll figure out how to be more than skilled political navigators with each other. Elijah followed her back toward the palace, feeling the weight of decision made and the uncertainty of future being written in real time. His mission was complete. His actual work was just beginning. And somewhere in the intersection of political necessity and personal choice, he was building a life he'd never planned but somehow needed. His comm device showed 17 urgent messages from Earth Command demanding immediate response. He'd answer them soon. But first, he was going to finish walking through the cultivation gardens with someone who'd transformed his mission from temporary assignment to chosen future, and acknowledge that sometimes completing your work meant staying instead of leaving. The formal announcement happened in the planetary hall, the largest public space in Kevareth's capital, designed to hold thousands when major governance decisions required public witness. It was filled to capacity now. Representatives from every faction that had participated in the Accord's negotiations, regional leaders, cultural groups, religious organizations, and general populace who'd heard rumors that the human mediator who'd facilitated their unprecedented cooperation might be staying. Elijah stood beside Silthara on the speaker's platform, wearing formal diplomatic attire but human, rather than attempting to adapt Kevareth aesthetic. If he was going to announce a 7-year extension of his mission, he'd do it clearly as a human choosing to serve Kevareth interests rather than pretending to be something he wasn't. 3 days ago, Silthara addressed the massive assembly, her voice amplified through the hall's acoustic systems. Commander Elijah Hayes completed his official mission to Kevareth. The treaty framework we call the Kevareth Accords was finalized, signed by all participating factions, and prepared for implementation. By all objective measures, his work was finished. The hall was silent, thousands of Kevareth waiting to hear what came next, and then I prevented his departure. Silthara's admission generated murmurs throughout the assembly. I stood on his landing platform and told him he could not leave because I believed his absence would destabilize everything we had built together. I claimed that the political cooperation enabling the Accords depended on his continued presence as trusted mediator. I requested that he extend his mission by 5 to 7 years to institutionalize the frameworks he had demonstrated. More murmurs, louder now, mixing concern and approval. Some of you believe that request was appropriate, that preserving stability justifies asking additional sacrifice from someone who has already given 18 months. Others believe it was manipulation, using political pressure to exploit his sense of duty. She paused. Both assessments have merit. What I asked was enormous, potentially unfair, and definitely beyond his original mission parameters. I make no apology for asking, but I acknowledge the weight of the request. She gestured to Elijah, indicating he should speak. He stepped forward, looking out at thousands of faces representing the civilization he'd helped stabilize. When Queen Silthara first told me the cooperation I'd facilitated would collapse without my continued presence, my immediate reaction was that couldn't possibly be true. Surely a civilization this old, this sophisticated, this politically experienced could maintain its own stability without depending on one human mediator. He activated holographic displays showing the stability assessments, the projection models, the documented evidence of correlation between his mediation presence and factional cooperation. But the data supported her claim. Every analysis showed the same pattern. Cooperation increased when I served as neutral arbitrator and decreased when I was absent. Not because Kevareth lacks capable leaders or wise governance, but because historical grievances and factional suspicions made it difficult to trust each other's mediation. I provided what you temporarily lacked: perceived impartiality backed by no historical stake in your internal politics. The displays shifted to show training frameworks, institutional development plans, systematic approaches to building local mediation capacity. If I stay, when I stay, my mission changes from treaty negotiation to capacity building. I will work to make myself obsolete by training Kevareth mediators in impartial facilitation approaches, by institutionalizing the frameworks that enabled cooperation, by creating structures that don't depend on any single individual. The goal is that in 5 to 7 years, you won't need me because you'll have developed local capacity to maintain what we built together. Regional leader Kenthvar stood from his section. Commander Hayes, many appreciate your service, but some question whether extending human presence creates dependency rather than building genuine capacity. How do we know you won't become permanent fixture we can't function without? You don't know, that risk is real. Elijah appreciated the directness of the question, which is why I'm negotiating specific terms with clear end date regardless of local politics at that time. 7 years maximum, even if stability hasn't fully transferred to local mediators. I'll work toward obsolescence, but I won't become indefinite crutch preventing your own institutional development. High Philosopher Sarath stood from her section. There are personal dimensions to this extension that some find concerning. Rumors suggest the commander's decision to stay involves personal relationship with the Queen, not just political calculation. The hall went silent, that particular silence that meant everyone was intensely interested in the answer, but unsure if asking was appropriate. Sulthara stepped forward before Elijah could respond. Philosopher Sarath raises what many are thinking but hesitant to voice. Let me address it directly. Yes, there is personal dimension to Commander Hayes's decision to stay. We have developed relationship over 18 months that transcends our official roles. That relationship influenced both my request and his consideration of it. She looked directly at the assembly. I will not apologize for that personal dimension. Leaders are people who develop connections, preferences, relationships that inform but do not control their governance decisions. The political need for Commander Hayes's continued presence is documented and real. That I also personally value his presence does not invalidate the political necessity. It means I advocated strongly for a solution that serves both collective interest and personal preference. And if the personal relationship fails, someone called from the upper levels, does the political commitment fail with it? No, Elijah answered before Sulthara could. The political commitment is separate from any personal relationship. Formal terms include provisions for handling personal complications without affecting professional obligations. If our personal relationship doesn't work, I still serve my 7-year extension. The stability of your civilization doesn't depend on whether Queen Sulthara and I successfully navigate cross-species relationship dynamics. Council member Yavara stood slowly, the elder statesperson whose opinion carried weight beyond her official position. I opposed human involvement from the beginning. I believed it would create dependency and corrupt our traditions. I have spent the past 3 days reviewing every assessment of the situation, every projection model, every alternative approach to maintaining stability without continued human presence. She paused for effect. I can find no viable alternative. Commander Hayes has become essential in ways that transcend normal diplomatic relationships. If he leaves now, we fail. If he stays and builds capacity as proposed, we have chance to succeed long-term. Therefore, despite my historical opposition to human involvement, I support the mission extension. That endorsement from a known skeptic shifted the room's energy. Elijah watched as Kevarath throughout the hall exchanged glances, reconsidered positions, began nodding in agreement. But, Yavara continued, I insist on strict accountability. Commander Hayes must document his capacity-building methods. His training frameworks must be transparent and reproducible. His mediation approaches must be teachable to Kevarath who lack his specific background. We cannot simply observe him working and hope we absorb the knowledge. We need systematic knowledge transfer. Agreed, Elijah said immediately. I'll provide comprehensive documentation, formal training programs, regular assessment of knowledge transfer effectiveness. The goal is making everything I do reproducible by local mediators who understand your culture better than I ever will. The debate continued for another hour, different factions raising concerns, proposing modifications to terms, questioning specific aspects of the arrangement. It was the same collaborative problem-solving that had characterized the Accord's negotiations, and Elijah found himself falling back into familiar rhythms of facilitation, helping groups articulate concerns and find frameworks that addressed competing interests. Finally, Sulthara called for formal consensus. Does this assembly support Commander Hayes's mission extension under the terms discussed? 7-year maximum, focus on capacity building, transparent knowledge transfer, formal accountability for institutional development. with personal relationship acknowledged but separate from political obligations. The consensus mechanism was complex, different voting procedures for different types of decisions, but the result was clear. Overwhelming support with some documented objections from conservative factions who still questioned human involvement. "Then it is settled," Sulthara announced. "Commander Elijah Hayes will extend his mission for purposes of institutional capacity building and local mediator training. Formal terms will be finalized within 48 hours. Earth Command will be notified officially, and Kevareth enters the next phase of implementing the accords with continued human assistance." The assembly dispersed gradually, various groups approaching Elijah with questions, expressions of support, or continued concerns they wanted to discuss privately. He spent another 3 hours in follow-up conversations, providing reassurance and clarifying expectations, until finally the hall was empty except for Sulthara and a few remaining advisors handling logistics. "That went better than I expected," Elijah said, exhaustion settling in now that the formal announcement was complete. "You're good at facilitation. People trust you to hear their concerns and find viable frameworks." Sulthara dismissed her advisors, leaving them alone in the vast empty hall. "Earth Command sent formal response an hour ago. They're supporting the extension but requiring regular reporting on both political stability metrics and your personal well-being. Apparently, they're concerned about exploitation. They're right to be concerned. This arrangement has significant potential for exploitation if we're not careful. Which is why we'll be extremely careful. Formal terms, clear boundaries. Regular assessment." She moved to stand directly in front of him. "But I'm also grateful you're staying, for all the complicated political reasons, and for the personal ones that make it more meaningful than any diplomatic arrangement I've negotiated. I'm terrified I'm making the wrong choice. That 7 years from now, I'll look back and wonder why I sacrificed my Earth life for alien political stability." "That's possible. This could be a magnificent mistake." She touched his face gently. "Or it could be the most important work of your life combined with personally meaningful relationship that justifies every sacrifice. We won't know which until we live it." "That's not particularly reassuring." "I'm not offering reassurance. I'm offering honesty about uncertainty." She smiled, which seems appropriate for two people who are about to spend 7 years building institutions while simultaneously building relationship across species boundaries. Elijah's comm device chimed, his sister. "Just saw the news feeds. You're actually doing this insane thing. Call me immediately so I can tell you you're either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, possibly both." He showed the message to Sulthara, who laughed. "I like your sister already. Bring her to Kevareth soon. I want to meet the family that produced someone willing to give 7 years to institutional capacity building and cross-species relationship exploration." "She's going to interrogate you about your intentions regarding her little brother. I would be disappointed if she didn't. Family protective instincts should transcend species." They stood together in the empty planetary hall where thousands had just witnessed Elijah commit to 7 more years, and he felt the strange certainty that his mission was actually beginning rather than ending. "I should contact Earth Command. File formal reports. Begin planning the capacity-building frameworks. Establish training schedules. Coordinate family visitation logistics. You should do all those things tomorrow. Tonight, you should rest and process that you just agreed to restructure your entire life." She took his hand. "Come, I'll show you the quarters we've prepared, larger than your current space, designed for long-term residence rather than temporary mission, with considerations for human needs that we've learned over your 18-month stay. You prepared new quarters before I agreed to stay. I prepared them hoping you would agree. Also practical necessity. If you're here for 7 years, you need proper living space, not temporary mission accommodations." She led him from the hall toward the residential sections of the palace complex. "They're near my personal chambers, which is both convenient for frequent consultation and personally motivated preference for your proximity. You're being remarkably direct about personal motivations. You asked for directness. I'm providing it. She squeezed his hand. We're both learning to communicate beyond diplomatic frameworks. It's uncomfortable but probably necessary for relationship that functions as more than political arrangement. The new quarters were significantly larger than his previous space. Multiple rooms, human-appropriate furniture, environmental controls adjusted for Earth-standard comfort, and window views overlooking the cultivation gardens where they'd had their honest conversation 3 days ago. It was designed for permanence rather than temporary posting, and seeing it made the reality of 7 years settle into something concrete. "Thank you," Elijah said, looking around the space that would apparently be home for the foreseeable future. This makes it real in ways the formal announcement didn't. Good real or bad real? Both terrifying and right simultaneously. He turned to face her. "I'm committed now. 7 years of capacity building, institutional development, and whatever we discover personally. No backing out when it gets difficult." "No backing out," Sulthara agreed. "We're both committed to making this work politically and personally, which means when challenges arise, and they will, we address them together rather than letting either dimension fail." That sounds like a relationship commitment. It is a relationship commitment. Formal diplomatic arrangement with personal relationship integrated into the framework rather than pretending they're separate. She moved closer, her presence filling the space between them. "Welcome to permanent posting, Commander Hayes. Try not to regret the choice too strenuously. When governance complications become overwhelming and personal relationship challenges make everything more difficult. I make no promises about avoiding regret, but I'm committed despite the probability of occasional overwhelming difficulty." That's appropriately honest. She kissed him then, their first kiss that was clearly personal rather than culturally exploratory, and Elijah found himself responding with the certainty that he'd made the right choice even if it was complicated beyond anything he'd anticipated. When they separated, Sulthara said, "I should return to my chambers and let you settle into your new space. We both have extensive logistics to manage tomorrow, formal terms to finalize, Earth reporting to complete, capacity-building frameworks to develop." "Stay for a while," Elijah heard himself say. "Help me settle in. Share the evening that marks transition from temporary mission to permanent posting." Is that professional request or personal invitation? Personal invitation that acknowledges we're building something beyond professional obligation. "Then I'll stay." She settled onto one of the human-appropriate seating surfaces, looking surprisingly natural despite the furniture not being designed for Kevareth physiology. "Tell me about your family. If they're visiting Kevareth, I should understand the relationships that matter to you beyond diplomatic service." So Elijah talked about his sister, his nephew and niece, his parents who'd supported his diplomatic career even when it meant years of separation. He showed pictures and shared stories, and Sulthara listened with genuine interest, asking questions about human family dynamics and making observations about similarities and differences with Kevareth kinship structures. "Your nephew will be 18 when your extension ends," she observed. "Nearly adult by human standards. Your niece will be 13. You're missing significant portions of their development." "I know. Emily reminded me of that when I told her I was considering staying. But you're staying anyway. Because sometimes the work matters more than the development you miss. And because communication technology means I won't be completely absent from their lives, just physically distant." He paused. "Also because what I'm building here with you is important enough to justify the sacrifice." That's significant admission. You asked for honesty, I'm providing it. They talked until evening became night. Bioluminescent city lights visible through the windows, and Elijah felt his understanding of what he'd committed to shift from abstract political arrangement to concrete personal reality. 7 years, Institutional capacity building. Relationship exploration with someone from a different species who ruled a planet. Family visits and Earth connections maintained across impossible distance. Work that mattered combined with personal connection that felt meaningful beyond diplomatic necessity. Eventually, Silthara stood to leave, and Elijah walked her to the door of his new permanent quarters. "Thank you for staying," she said quietly, "for believing the need was real, for being willing to sacrifice personal plans for collective benefit, for choosing to explore what we might become together alongside the institutional work. Thank you for showing me the truth about what I'd accomplished and asking me to stay despite knowing it was an unfair request." He touched her hand. "I'm committed now, to the capacity building and to discovering what we become beyond our official roles. Then we begin tomorrow, building institutions that outlast us while building relationship that matters to us. Should be interesting challenge for two people whose default mode is diplomatic frameworks and careful negotiation. The most interesting challenge of my life. Mine as well." She kissed him once more, brief, affectionate, promising future complications and meaningful connection in equal measure. Sleep well, Elijah Hayes, who gave 7 years to alien political stability and cross-species relationship exploration. Tomorrow, we start the actual work. Then she was gone, and Elijah was alone in permanent quarters on an alien world where he'd committed to building both institutions and